It's been a busy weekend. Welcome to Evolution Hour, clickety-clack, typewriters, analog, timepieces, website, Troubles in Paradise. Yay! Now then, as I said, started a little bit late. This was an interesting little one because I had to reconfigure some stuff that came along, as you all know, for those of you who are watching one episode to the next. Titans, the Creationist book, which eventually is going to be getting more to dinosaurs, although don't expect any vast revelations because this is creationists trying to make sense of dinosaur data to which they have contributed absolutely nothing. Let me also bring up my very welcome patron list. Without which this program could not be done so effectively. I am very, very grateful to everything that is done by our supporters of the project, and I'm going to be plugging away as long as possible. So, where are we in our little world? This is one in which functionally the part one and the part two are kind of all the same thing, because I had encountered an interesting pile of stuff where Andrew Sibley last year jumped on the critic Mark Sutton, who has been riding a hobby horse for years, claiming that Darwin stole the ideas of a prior thinker, in this case Matthew, and that he has written a brand new book on this subject, and Sibley is writing a review of it. Well, I thought I would want to be able to exploring a little bit more on that little subject, and we'll be getting to that in just a minute. The lead into this came because in this chapter on the kinds, where we're not really getting a list of dinosaur kinds anywhere in it, it's dangling material on natural selection, and to what extent was it done by people other than Darwin before Darwin, which means that Sarfati and Tay are tiptoeing close to the Darwin isn't original argument that you find with Sutton's bit. And along the way, Sarfati and Tay cited historian Noel Weeks, who was born in 1943, died just in 2020, a 1998 article that he did at creation.com, the Journal of Creation, I think, that summarized the creationist spin on the origins of Darwinian thinking and brought up an awful lot about Karl Marx along the way, which was suggesting a little bit about the kind of obsessions that Weeks was bringing in. And now what intrigued me is that I hadn't heard of this Weeks guy before. He was not in my reference field. He had never popped up anywhere in my bit. So he was a new character. And since this was an article that was like 20 years old, I'm going, wow, has he done stuff since? That's when I found out that he died in 2020. But he had a sprinkling of material. And it turns out the creation.com has a little website entry on Noel Weeks's contributions to the creationist literature, which I'll be putting a link up to as well. And one of which was from 1978, which contested the historical idea that the old biblical chronology was one of a domed earth thing. And this was the creation.com post I'm going to be putting up is just a teeny little excerpt, which if you thought that was the whole article, it isn't. They implied that they say this was originally published in this other journal, but you would have no idea just how much was going on in there. Fortunately, I was able to find the original article that was involved, and that brought up something else, because in that it was originally written in 1972, but published in a theological context in 1978. And it also happened to have a criticism of Weeks's position from another scholar, Paul Helm, that is at the tail end of that PDF. And so you can pay attention to both of those little things, because Helm was accusing Weeks of misrepresenting philosophers that he was dealing with, and his literalism was not terribly justified. Now, remember, this is from 1978. We're in 2023, and the fact that so much of this is popping up in that creationism venue immediately brings up the idea, is Weeks a young earth creationist? Otherwise, why would they be bringing up relying on him at all? Sarfati and Tay are really quite rigorous in not merely restricting themselves to an awful lot of creationist posts. About half of the sources so far in the book are just creationist ones, but specifically Creation Ministries International material. Very, very narrow frame. So you'll be able to see some of the stuff that Weeks has available, a relatively small number of listings. But one of which that I discovered was a lecture by Weeks on evolution that he did in 2015. And this was like about an hour and some odd long. He's very affable and puts up pretty much basically the same old shtick of origins or bust and the like. But what was intriguing about it is, from this, would you ever get the impression that he was a young earth creationist? No chronology issues. He shies away at every little moment. He may mention briefly the idea that evolutionists were thinking in terms of millions of years, but he didn't really venture an opinion on that until way down at the end, when in the Q&A section, somebody asked him about the chronology matter. And there, although he tap danced with great agility, it sure sounds like he's a young earth creationist, because he's doubting that radiometric dating works. He mentions that carbon-14 has been found in places where you shouldn't expect it millions of years old, in which case, yes, he's relying on young earth creationist apologetics, which I suspect he's never bothered to fact check. And judging from Paul Helm's analysis in that 1978 piece, he's really adroit at leaving crap out that he doesn't want to discuss. I thought it was an intriguing little context to go into. Now, getting into, and there's also another post that Sarfati and Tay are relying on this Darwin issue. Charles Darwin's Illegitimate Brainchild is what it's called, by Grigg in 2004, which again, so far, Sarfati and Tay have kind of been dangling their ammunition in a way that's downplaying it. So they're bringing up topics that are not terribly controversial or incendiary, but citing stuff that's much more incendiary than their position is, because Grigg is talking about Darwin. His view is of dubious credit in terms of his role in actually developing evolution. And Grigg briefly mentioned the Patrick Matthew matter at the end of it, which connects up to Andrew Sibley's piece that I was going to be putting into a much later show. So what is Mark Sutton's bit about Patrick Matthew? Patrick Matthew was a guy who had written a book on naval architecture and what woods are best to be used for this. And this was done back in the 1830s. And along the way, he just mentions a little dribble about natural selection using that phrase, and the idea of what would be differential success of that. And it turns out that quite a few different writers were thinking along in the same lines. Now, when Darwin's big book came out in 1859, Matthew actually contacted Darwin and said, well, shouldn't you be giving me priority? And Darwin really was not thinking that he needed to do that. Now, all Sibley has done is draw upon a couple posts from John Dingwall from 2022 reviewing Sutton's book. Only one of which, however, is available online, so you can read the whole bloody thing, the Daily Mail one. And I'll be putting that up. But that's an adequate substitute, because that's half of his argument right there. And he's basically making very specific points to supposedly show that Sutton has a tremendously good case. Well, not everyone is so convinced, because Jeff Cole in 2022, and it came out after Sibley's piece, so I wouldn't have expected him to have known about it. Although I'm not holding my breath that he's ever going to be making any mention of it at CMI. But at any rate, it's a very extensive review of the book, and a discussion of why it's a really bad argument. And by the way, it's not something in the Daily Mail, it's in the leading journal Evolution. So it's a little bit more solid, frankly. And it goes on about the point is there's a huge difference between coming up with the germ of an idea and actually doing something with the idea. And Cole makes a very legitimate point about in his own personal history about how he had been scooped by somebody who comes along and looks at a detail that he missed in his paper and making a much more momentous discovery based on that. Well, at no point would Cole then be thinking, I should be getting the credit for what this other person did. I should actually be hitting myself for not having thought of all of this implication on my own. And that's functionally what we're getting into with Patrick Matthew and Charles Darwin, because Cole quite correctly points out that the one thing Patrick Matthew never did on this subject after he dangled this natural selection bit in this book on boat building was do anything with it. He never assembled a new argument that was specifically oriented for this. He wasn't doing experimentation. He wasn't contacting people and building up a big thing, which is what both Darwin and Wallace did independently. And so kind of like Cole didn't use this analogy, but I'll deal with it. It's the difference between the pre-Columbian world and post-Columbian world of Columbus as air quotes discoverer of America versus Leif Erikson and the Norse colony in the Americas as the discovery of America. Yeah, Leif Erikson got here first, but it was the Spaniards who really did something with it. Not a nice thing that they did, but nonetheless, there it is. And so the mere invention of an object, the prioritization of what you came up with first versus who does what with it, Cole makes a very persuasive argument, and I would agree with it, that Darwin deserves the credit still, that he was the one that came up with the great big model. If you just look at the sheer volume, even Wallace over many, many years never quite catches up to Darwin in terms of output. And his works tend to be much more generic and more philosophical statements of things. They're not nearly the kind of relentless analysis that Darwin did in book after book after book. So there's a reason why Darwin has the reputation that he does. And so it would be interesting for anybody that wants to then follow up on this own to compare the versions that are in the Sibley piece versus the various sources and find out what's going on. Well, let's get back a little bit to, I got my little Weeks material in here. The Conversations Matter thing from Weeks. It was a fascinating video to watch, his 2015 lecture, because I was, of course, primed to see, is he going to mention anything about the chronology and what examples was he going to be bringing up? So he brings up the obligatory Darwinian racism, although he doesn't really hammer it home. Instead, of course, he makes no mention whatsoever that there were any Christian racists. Connects it up to the Nazis, but he's basically blaming Adam Smith more than Darwin. And at that point, he's also bringing up this Marxist angle, which he then, as you can see, has been a kind of an obsession of his in the 1970 or 1998 article that Sarfati and Tay cited. Of course, he brings up origins or bust. Well, how did life originate? Paley's watchmaker argument shows up. And he mentions, dangles peripherally the notion of distinct species. And although also a historian, Weeks had a zoological training, I think he had a doctorate in it. And yet he doesn't bring up specific examples of organisms. And it kind of sounds like he's not really liking the idea that speciation takes place at all, or that species are so vague and meaningless that they have no context. He never once uses the word kind, and he certainly never uses the word Barrowman, which would be connecting him up to the more recent barrowmanological literature. So again, he's tiptoeing around a topic in a way that his audience, which was a group of evangelicals in a Presbyterian church in America, he'd flown all the way over from Australia to attend this thing, may or may not have known a great deal about, although there were some halfway decent questions in the not gigantic Q&A section at the end of it. Brings up Alfred Wallace and gives a not entirely satisfactory summary of his viewpoint. Doesn't mention anything at all about his socialism or his belief in spiritualism, but again, waves Adam Smith and about competition of survival of the fittest as the Darwinian model, which, if you want to be fussy about it, Wallace did have an input in suggesting to Darwin that he should use the survival of the fittest shorthand, which came from Herbert Spencer. So there was this bit about different cultural groups and different scholarly niches going on here, and how that was cross-fertilizing in that period after The Origin came out and up until Darwin's death in the 1880s. Then Weeks brings up microevolution versus macroevolution. No instances of it. Dangles fossil gaps, brings up Gould, and sort of punctuated equilibrium, but not actually discussing it by name. By the way, in this bit, there may have been some references and the like in a screen somewhere in the show, but we weren't getting that. We were just having him in front of the lectern. Although, judging from the content of what he did in the stuff that he does have text for, he's not that methodical an analyst. And then by the time then they go into Q&A, there's a discussion of dominant versus recessive genes and scientific problems with the theory of evolution, and an awful lot of the same shtick that anybody that's familiar with stuff would have. He mentions the mathematical challenges to the theory of evolution, which may or may not refer to some of the conferences that have brought up these things, or it may refer to some of the creationists that have brought up stuff on this. He was not detailed enough to have any idea what the hell he was talking about. This is about an hour into the show. And the questioner just after that brought up James Perloff's 1999 book, Tornado in a Junkyard, which is an overtly young Earth creationist book and a not particularly well-researched one. He didn't indicate that he had either read that work or have any direct response to it, just kind of went back to his trope. And then why is it important for Christians to understand evolution and Darwin, asks the questioner. And Weeks prefers a big picture approach where you can't get order from disorder, or evolution can't solve the problem of evil, as though the theocratic option really actually explains anything much better. And that means that the nuts and bolts of evolution, which is what you would need to know in order to argue that evolution wasn't actually happening, he kind of pushes that to the sideline. And he brings up altruism, mentioning briefly the genetic aspect, but still really sounding like he's pretty far away from any of the actual work. He is aware of the kin selection idea, which is a part of what goes into thinking about altruism, but certainly by 2015 was only a tiny portion of the whole bit. There was a huge technical literature on this process and how you have to have the issue between direct and indirect reciprocity. There's a whole bunch of stuff that had come along in that area. And I have not a great feeling that Weeks had ever bumped into any of that technical literature. If only because it tends not to get discussed much in any anti-evolution literature at all. And so if he's kind of riffing off of stuff secondarily downstream, how would he know anything about it? And he mentions consciousness, which again is a whole interesting issue about how that occurs in a biological system. He was showing no indication that he was being very familiar with that. So then at 1 hour, 8 minutes in, that's when the questioner asked about the fossil record and chronology, where Weeks sounds like he doesn't think there is like 20,000 BC. So he's not willing to come out and just flat out say, I'm a young Earth creationist and I base it on this and this and this. Instead, he's tiptoeing around it. And it's very likely that that's how he had been approaching all of his material, based on what the links that I can put up and you follow up on that yourself are the ones that I'm not directly linking to, but the stuff that's in the CMI synopsis. He's somebody that has a young earth creationist position, but it's closeted. And he's not actually bringing out any context on that. Then he alludes to problems reconciling biblical dates with the surrounding culture. This is right at the end of the lecture. And that one, I think, is relating to the fact that people trying to figure out when the Exodus took place, for example, can't reconcile it with the chronology of the period. If you're going by the traditional date, which is biblically, you arrive, if you use a Bishop Ussher style stuff, and remember, weeks is probably coming from that framework, you're talking about roughly 1500 BC. Whereas all the regular historical and biblical analysis material that doesn't come from a young earth creationist perspective is running around 1200 BC for that period, 300-year gap in that. And he didn't illuminate what the hell he meant by any of that. And of course, he's dead now, so he's not going to be writing any further on the element of it. But this, I think, Weeks is a useful exemplar of somebody who is affable and within the frame of their lecture context, very articulate. He's presenting a very nice, concise presentation of the worldview that he wants to have and why he thinks it's such a terrible thing for people to believe in evolution, because he's basically dumping into the dogs and cats living together mode. With the automatic and hidden assumption that somehow or other the creationism that he's not terribly clear about the context of or the details of is a viable alternative here. And the implication that if there's anything that does go wrong in the Christian culture or the religious culture, it can't be the religion's fault. No, it's got to be due to Adam Smith or Marx or somebody infiltrating the wrong attitudes into things. But he never really got close enough to make a really clear analysis to indicate even if that was his position. It'd have been fun to deal with. So where to put somebody like a Weeks? He's in the kind of generic secondary source redactor who funnels bits and pieces of things and produces a little buffed version of it. I kind of put him in the same ballpark as some of the pundits at the Discovery Institute who are below the Michael Behe level. David Klinghoffer would be in this kind of realm, that are presenting a glossed up, tidied up version of the dogmatic position and being very scholarly because they have little footnotes and the whole 9 yards on that. And the fact that Sarfati and Tay felt this deserved to have a reference in their book when so much could have been dealt with, and of course regular scholarship could have been dealt with. The fact that they're picking this little obscure character, sufficiently obscure that I'd never heard of him until they brought him up, is an indication, I think, that it keeps me primed to think that this is probably going to be an attitude of how they're going to be dealing with this all the way down the road. That I'm going to now see whether or not it's going to be a predictive model, that they are tactically very precise about how they wade into areas where they'll try to avoid, in some respects, controversial areas, or find ways to diffuse them. The fact that they brought up the soft tissue or the survival of dinosaurs in pictographs and the like, and generally implying that there's some problems with some of those identifications. They're going to be getting back into it a little bit later, but they still swallow an awful lot of claptrap, and we'll be mentioning that in volume 2 of the Rocks Were There. And Weeks and some of these others now will be plugged in to that context because it gets a further refinement of some of the little penetration levels of how creationist apologetics runs on, which means that if you were to have just watched or bumped into a lecture by somebody like Weeks, and there are people doing that today, they can deliver an entire speech And if it weren't for that one little question down at the end, if you only go by the actual lecture that they gave, you would have no idea that they are a young Earth creationist. And yet that's the worldview that is in their head, but they don't feel that it's appropriate to share that with the audience so that they have an idea. I have no problems explaining in no uncertain terms that I understand the universe is 13 some odd billion years old and the Earth is over 4 billion years old, and that synapsids were developing 250 million years ago. And our species is coming from hominids that run back millions of years, and our particular species fissioned off somewhere around 300,000 years ago. That's all part of my map of time, which has increasingly large number, I hope, of data points that are getting filled in so that the pages of my mental map of time, first of all, it's a big book, and secondly, that there's lots of information in that book. Whereas somebody just coming at to a speech by a Weeks type, they're getting a worldview that's down on Darwinism and pro on the generic religion and is talking about good and evil and all sorts of important philosophical issues up at that dogma level, but not really getting much accurate or detailed when it comes to the data floor, and no way of really checking out how this fellow is going astray. Even the post from that 1998 article on Darwin is relatively superficial. And the 1978 piece that he was doing is quite long. It's about 10 or 12 pages long and relatively small print. And yet tiptoes around so many issues of geochronology. Now, 1978, well, of course, he's writing it in 1972, but that's still in a period when young Earth creationism is starting to hit the ground running. So what background context was in his head during that period that he never tells us? Doesn't cite any young Earth creationist anywhere in that 72/78 piece, and steers clear of it in even the 98 material. And yet, where is it being printed? In a creationist venue. So keep an eye out for people who have that fence straddler mode. You find that John Sanford is starting to take on that mode as he's doing material in intelligent design literature. You have Paul Nelson, who certainly is taking that mode at the Discovery Institute, who is himself a young Earth creationist, and yet although he doesn't deny it, he doesn't go out of his way to bring it up, and the Discovery Institute doesn't go out of their way to make mention of it. And so he can then write an article with Richard Buggs, which I analyzed in some detail in the Roxworth Average Jackson, came up in some of the appendix work and the like from 2016, that on the orphan gene matter, that what is happening, because no one is suspecting that Richard Buggs is a young Earth creationist, and yet his co-author has a baggage of young Earth creationism. So where are they intersecting? The article itself, by the way, didn't have any creationist claims in it. It was just a murky analysis of the orphan gene matter, where, boy, they were sidestepping information right and left. And so you have to wonder then, Buggs, who is a, air quotes, evolutionist, but also religious, who's kind of weighed in on the idea that there was a real Adam and Eve, although this Adam and Eve may have lived 700,000 years ago, which kind of puts it in Homo erectus territory. Are you going to think that through in any greater detail? So far, no. And so that's Weeks style wiffle-waffly, to where there is a position that's not being presented, that's out there as a hide the ball problem. And most anti-evolutionists are much more overt and direct and honest about what their positions are. They may burst into flame because they make such egregious statements, but at least you have a little better idea of where they're standing on the subject. But the fence straddler sorts, I find particularly annoying, to some extent, I think it may be because they have a mind that likes to tunnel vision in on the parts they want to pay attention to, and that they may have temperaments that don't like to get involved with air quotes controversies, just as Weeks didn't sound like he really wanted to dive into the chronology matter. So they figure if they just kind of tap dance around it, they don't have to think about it. There we go. And they can go home and not have a problem with it. But the problems don't go away. The data doesn't go away. So anyway, that gives you kind of up to speed on that material. It's an intriguing issue. There's a segment also at, I think I have most of the stuff in tip 1.6 or 1.7. It blurs sometimes in my head which segment it comes up with, relating to the 2009 in particular, the Darwin centennial, 150 years after the publication. I have a funny little word for that. I've forgotten what it is. Anyway, a whole bunch of people came out, and a whole bunch of critics came out with books saying, "Oh, Darwin ain't so hot," in that 2009 period, and put an analysis on that. And one of whom in that period is Sutton. And of course, as we can see, Sutton just can't give it up. So anyway, I don't see anyone in the chat overlay. So the fact that I came on a little bit late, everyone was getting used to me coming on at like 12:15 or 12:30. Sorry, folks, that I cheated you out of that by coming on closer to 1 a.m., which was the normal time on that. But you'll be able to catch it in due course. We're at a half an hour. I got all the material in there. I'll be putting all the links in, and you can have a field day on that. And we'll see you all next week. I will put, however, my advert for The Rocks Were There, Volume 1, which is a work that I am immensely proud of. Jackson and I came up with a really nifty little material, and we're going to be doing yet another nifty bit of material for the next work. And I'll try not to talk over this. And a click. Book 2 should be easily as bulky as book 1 was. So much material comes along. There's so many interesting little topics and stuff to deal with, and human evolution, the origin of tetrapods. There's more geology material. There's just a lot of stuff going on there, in addition to all the detailed nitty-gritty of the flood mythology and the lengths creationists will go to try to make that sound plausible. Woo! So hopefully I will be able to get that book in slid under the wire, no bigger than volume 1. And of course, don't forget Evolution Slam Dunk, which goes into the reptile mammal transition. We cite it at several points, but it's a whole book on its own and a documentation of just how anti-evolutionists have managed to avoid the reptile mammal transition, which is the ultimate example if you want to bring up macroevolution to anybody, because you got the props. You carry the props around with you, the jaw and the ear bones. And so all you need to do is to remember some of the little benchmarks in this, and probanognaathids and all that cute stuff, and Robert Broom. And you'll have an instantaneous portable show and tell to remind people of why the reptile mammal transition proves macroevolution and how anti-evolutionists ignore it. There's only two vertebrate classes, remember, that have appeared in the last quarter of a billion years, mammals and birds. And birds now have a much stronger connection to dinosaurs than was the case prior to the 1990s. And of course, the reptile mammal transition. So evolution's got the two vertebrate classes from the last quarter of a billion years nailed down. Wow. I mean, that's 100%. So anyway, everybody take care if you're in places that have unpleasant things happening to them. And there's still some places where that's happening a lot. I will not be waxing on so many of the political issues, although anybody that follows me on Twitter will notice I don't shy away from diving into a lot of these little areas, but at no point will I have accepted a wooden penguin, and you shouldn't either. So catch you all next week. Stay safe, everybody. And